Sarah Butcher is hosting the conversations today, and Sarah is currently an exec producer for the space, so she supports commissioned organisations to develop and deliver their film and broadcast projects. Sarah's also the co-founder and creative director of independent production company North South, and she's a theatre artist herself. So she comes to this with experience of pushing the boundaries of how a performance is made for in-theatre and screen audiences. So it's just a really great setup, I think, for this session. So Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, I'm Sarah. I'm a white woman with blonde hair in a bun. I'm wearing a white shirt with a gold necklace, and I'm wearing glasses today. So my interest in virtual production comes from an artistic perspective, a failed application to the BFI, and a place of curiosity. I'm intrigued by its possibilities to tell stories in new ways. VP isn't a new technology, as Sarah Ellis reminded me. Now it seems to be in our language more and more, and we're hearing and seeing where it's meeting artistic practice and production processes beyond traditional film and television making. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Professor Damian Murphy. Damian, could I ask you to describe yourself?
Hi, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Damian Murphy. I'm a middle-aged white man with short blonde hair and dark framed glasses and a small beard, and I'm wearing a black zippy top this afternoon and a green shirt.
Thanks, Damian. Damian's Professor of Sound and Music Computing in the Audio Lab at the University of York, and the Director of XR Stories, who support research, development and innovation in technology-led creative content, experiences and stories. He directs the XR Network Plus project, exploring the next generation of UK-led virtual production. So Damian, I gave you the enviable task, or unenviable task, depending on how you look at it, of explaining what virtual production is. So kicking off with that, how it works in terms of hardware and software, and who's involved in making it work.
Yeah, well, I'll do my best, Sarah. And please do poke questions if you feel I leave something out or jump over something too quickly. I think, first of all, as you've already highlighted in your conversation with Sarah Ellis, it's a somewhat established technology and technique and workflow, but it's also one that is evolving. And it's evolving and changing into something new, I think it's fair to say, but it comes from very established techniques, technologies and workflows from the film industry. So it's founded in the language of film, or film and high-end television, as we now sort of call that. And it moves on from green screen production, the idea of actors performing against a green screen, and then after the performance, after the production, in what's called post-production, all the world that those actors are inhabiting are replace the green background. And so it's a bringing on of that technology as computing technology has, and other technologies as well, have become more prevalent in the making process. And so we can go back, I think, to one of the first key examples of this was the Jungle Book, the live action Jungle Book film in 2016, where a virtual environment, a digital environment, didn't exist in the real world environment, was used to build and inform the pre-visualization process of how the film was actually going to be shot and produced with actors. And so at the heart of this virtual production area is this idea of world building, is building an environment in which we're going to place a character, an object, a story. And that world building, I guess, might have taken place on storyboards before. It might have taken place in terms of rules that you establish on paper or in a script, but now more and more it's also being created in a 3D visual digital domain. And then the next sort of key moment in that the development process of this technique was in 2019, which was the live action remake of the Lion King. And in that film, a 100-mile wide virtual world was created digitally for the characters to inhabit and to build and to inhabit and to interact with. And as that process and production developed, then not only was the virtual world a place where the story was located, but it became a place where the story was shot. And so there was an interaction between virtual cameras in the digital domain, how you look through that 3D virtual world, and physical cameras in the actual production domain, so that the two started to become interlinked. And that also brought in other elements into this, such as virtual reality headsets, to look at the visualizations as they were happening on set to get a sense of how things were actually playing out. And so the process of production on set and then post-production taking place in editing suites after the production is starting to become compressed into one thing. And then I guess the poster child of modern virtual production as it now is sort of commonly understood is probably The Mandalorian. So the Disney Plus Star Wars world sort of mini series, and there are technical reasons why this became important, but there was the sense of we could now do the shooting in an LED volume, as it's called. So using high resolution LED screens to actually create or visualize the 3D virtual world physically in the real world, so that actors can work with it, directors can start to sort of look and block scenes more directly and change things live. And so that's sort of one of the biggest sort of shifts and changes, and that is kind of where virtual production currently sits. But into that, then we also need to add other technologies. We need to add motion capture. How are we capturing how the physical camera moves? How do we start to capture how real characters move, so that we can ingest them into the digital world and start to interact with them and play with them in the digital world? So motion capture is key, capturing figures, capturing characters, volumetric capture to properly capture three-dimensional aspects of these characters and these places and spaces. And great examples of that, particularly early examples, is Andy Serkis's work, particularly in Lord of the Rings, and all the subsequent work that's come from that in terms of building digital cameras that we can really sort of interact with and who give us, bring emotional meaning to a story. So motion capture, volumetric capture are really important for getting characters into these digital worlds. I've already mentioned about virtual reality headsets. Yes, they're great for giving audiences a particular experience, but they're being used on set to visualize, as I said, as well, as part of the making process. And at the heart of all of these technologies is the fact that this is all done now in real time. So there's what's called a gaming engine. So this is where the world of film and TV production blend with gaming production, which has had its own workflow and techniques and technologies that have moved separately at the same time and evolved separately. And at the heart of a digital game is something called the game engine, which enables you to build a world, give it a sort of meaning, give it physics, give it visualization and lighting and sound. And but that can now be deployed in real time as part of the filmmaking process. And the key, what are called game engines, and names that most people may have heard if you're interested in virtual production, which are Unreal, the Unreal Engine, and Unity are probably the two key ones. And really here now, it's about bringing that physical and digital world together in real time to make aspects, again, remembering where we're coming from here, filmmaking, make it more efficient, make it more economical, but also to bring opportunities and affordances that probably haven't been able to happen before, or they'd happen over a much longer period of time, because you maybe go production, post-production, editing, and then go back to production again to reshoot and change things. I should also say, underneath all of that, we may want to come back at this later, is starting to happen is the use of AI to automate some of these processes and to make some of these processes work more efficiently and to do things that more quickly that might take longer. But I think the most exciting bit, and why we're all here today on this sort of webinar, is what the new affordances of these technologies, these workflows mean for other creative organizations, for other artists, not working in the film world, not necessarily thinking of themselves as filmmakers or TV makers, but starting to think, what can this bring to my audience? And probably the best example of that at the moment is the ABBA Voyage experience in London, which is a bringing together of virtual production technology, the motion capture of those characters, creating the avatars, or the avatars as they call them, of the group, and then building an experience that is both pre-recorded using these LED wall technologies, but also live, because you've got a band there as well, and also with traditional theatre making as well, to bring the audience into this experience and to make them feel that it's actually a live experience, which it is, of course, in part. It's neither film nor theatre nor concert, nor, it's something other. And it connects with, 3,000 people per night and twice when they do a matinee in sort of 7 to 9 performances a week. And it's an amazing experience. And so, but it's not film and it's not TV, it's something else. It's not really a concert. Again, go and see it if you haven't seen it already and decide for yourself what this experience is and where things might be going on the back of that.
So what we're talking about here is that that meeting of the kind of the real and the virtual in real time, and how and what possibilities that affords. Thank you for outlining the process of that and the different elements that come together in order to kind of create virtual production experiences. Damian, when we spoke in the kind of preamble and the lead up to this, you mentioned to me that you found that some of the most interesting collaborations that you've had at XR Stories have been with artists and arts organisations. So moving away from those big ticket films that you mentioned, and even Aber Voyage with its kind of wonderfully big budget. Like, why do you think that is that you've seen that with those artists and arts organisations?
Yeah, I guess it's probably just worth saying XR Stories was established to support innovation and R&D in screen industry, so film, TV, games and related media. And we've been going for 6 years now, and we definitely saw a shift in terms of who engaged with us for the opportunities that we held. And it was very much the case that we saw a much greater response to the opportunity from, as you say, arts organisations who wanted to work with us than maybe traditional film and TV companies. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is, the economics of the industries that we're talking about here and the cycles of production. But I also think it's really it's about arts organisations being very, very good and very agile at looking for opportunities to create new work for their audiences, whatever their audience might be, or to engage with new audiences in a new way, and also to test their practice in different contexts. And I think that's that flexibility about knowing where you're coming from and where you want to go and what are the means to get to that end point is probably unique to a lot of arts organisations, different from film and TV production, which is, as you say, a mammoth sort of production process from beginning to end, and there's a lot of stakes involved. So I think it's that freedom to experiment, which was we saw and responded to. And also, I think, back then we didn't talk about virtual production in the way that we do now, and it was about XR technologies, about virtual reality, augmented reality. And it was about how arts organisations wanted to engage with those technologies to make something new with them, I think. And what could they do with a VR headset that they hadn't been able to do before? But the back-end technology behind that is the same as we've been explaining in terms of virtual production. So some really good examples that we helped to support over the last few years, kind of explore this in lots of different ways. One is a project called Grains of Recollection by a small organisation called Studio Maguire. And really that's about world building and storytelling and going from a very traditional aesthetic, which was three-dimensional paper-based worlds, so cutting out beautiful shapes and paper and populating them with characters and stories, was how you take those paper physical worlds into a virtual reality context and build a story where you can properly immerse your audience, your participant, in that story world. And so that's a great example of physical crafted elements and then building digital equivalents. And that's another term that sometimes gets used, building something what's called a digital twin. So there's a physical element and then you build a digital version of it in a game engine or similar, so that you can interact with it in a way that you can't in the physical world. So that was a great example of world building and shifting from physical to digital. There's a great project called Monoliths by York company. XR Stories is based in York, and Pilot Theatre, a York-based theatre company predominantly focused on younger audiences, and they've been exploring how they tell stories of digital technology over a number of years, and they have been developing their practice in that. And probably the pinnacle of that for now is a project called Monoliths. And Monoliths was about developing immersive storytelling experiences that celebrated the stories of 3 young women from the north of England and their connections to the northern landscape. And it's the most beautiful sort of piece of performance poetry, told in virtual reality, illustrated using digital, artistically, stylized versions of the landscapes that these young authors are talking about. And from a small, very sort of focused theatre company based in the north of England, they've been taking monoliths to film exhibitions all over the world, actually, in the VR streams. And so that's been a huge success for them, and a huge new audiences for them as well. And so that's about, again, immersive storytelling. It's about changing one's discipline and looking for new audiences. And then the third example is a project called Flood by a Sheffield-based company called Megaverse. And they were looking at how, again, we could take the virtual worlds that they were building in a virtual reality context using a headset and expand it out into the physical world to build sort of hybrid or blended performance experiences. And that culminated in a performance at the Sage in Gateshead, and that blended virtual production technology, so LED walls with a live audience, with actors within that LED volume, and some part of the audience in VR headsets, so they were in the world with the performers, but also it was streamed linearly online over YouTube. So lots of different ways of engaging with the story and the performance at the heart of their idea, using the technologies in quite different ways, actually. That was very interesting. So 3 examples of really innovative projects and how organizations have expanded their repertoire as a consequence.
Yeah, and I think,
oh, sorry, just to say that we've put and just put links to all of those examples in the chat.
oh, fantastic.
5 minutes left.
Fantastic, thank you. Those are really interesting examples, and starting to understand how those projects have worked through XR Stories, Damian, but also then have gone on to meet audiences after that research and development process. And so when I was doing my research, I've just noticed that a lot of funding opportunities and facilities for research and development in virtual production are now university-led. And so rather than sort of being artist-led, if that makes sense. And so if an artist or arts organisation has an idea that they want to explore, how do they access the technology and the funding through places like University of York?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting shift that we've seen over the last few years. The Creative Clusters project, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, of which XR Stories is one example, are great examples of how universities can support innovation in the place where they are, for the arts organisations, the cultural sector where they are, through, I guess, the capacity that a large university has in terms of expertise and facilities and resources. And I think that's becoming more the case now, and certainly recently, again, the Arts and Humanities Research Council have invested in a lot of universities around the UK in exactly these technologies. And I think that's really important, virtual production technologies, volumetric capture, LED walls and volumes where you can create new work. And I think that's really important because it's seeing a shift away from these facilities being entirely privately driven in large studio facilities that cost an awful lot to book out and use, into a place where there is the opportunity for these becoming more widely used by other aspects of the creative and cultural sector, and about to come online as well as the new CoStar initiative, which is infrastructure fundamentally to support film and live performance sectors around the UK. And it's 5 networked labs that are using these facilities, and more funding will come down the line probably next year in terms of how to access those facilities. So I think universities have a key role to play in this. They have the facilities, they're skilling up their staff to be able to use them and to bring people along in their own communities. It's not just for our own students and training our students, it's also for supporting our creative and cultural ecosystems. But finding the right way into the universities is really important, and there are many open doors into a university, and they take you down many different paths, and some of those will be fruitful and some of those won't. And I think that's really important. And again, I think some of us in the universities are realizing that. So XR Stories is one example. We have an outward-facing R&D lab now based in the city centre, not on our campus, that's for industry to come, and it's a place of collaboration, experimentation, presentation and play, most importantly. And other universities are following similar. We're off to Portsmouth University next week to see their CCIXR facility, and they've been doing that work in their part of the UK for quite some time. And so I think I would encourage, people on the call and your colleagues to explore what the networking opportunities are around these sort of placeholder tentpole sort of organizations in your regions, and what they're doing in this space to help support and engage and facilitate collaboration, and knock on the door and be persistent and find the right people, and hopefully then that leads to fruitful collaborations and brilliant new work.
Thank you, Damian.
We've only got a minute, and then we're going to bring Kenny and Damian, but there is a question, and I think you're sort of starting to answer it, but Sarah might have some comment to add as well, which is saying, where does access, inclusion and affordability come into this? I'm not expecting you to give the whole answer, Damian, but if you have a view on that, that would be great.
Yes, and then I'll just really quickly, it's fundamentally important actually, and I think that's one of the key things about, I guess, the investments that the Arts and Humanities Research Council have been making into this area, is to ensure that, again, these technologies, opportunities are not locked away behind big studio doors, and they start to trickle down into our creative and cultural community so that they can be explored more. Universities are a good place to do that. There are also other facilities coming online around the country that are more open, but I think that's, there's definitely a role for universities to play in enabling, again, our wider creative community to access them.
It also seems to me a lot, Damian, we talked about this around relationship building and connections between sort of artists and artist organizations and researchers, and then university facilities, and actually kind of building that network of people that then create that need for the access, with a research idea or a question that they are wanting to explore.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, smashing. I think we'll need to stop there. There are another couple of questions, so Damian, when you're off screen, perhaps you wouldn't mind having a look at the later questions, and if you have a response to them, please do. And if it, or we'll see if anybody else, Sarah might have a response as well. So thank you, and back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Damian. So I'd like to introduce Kenny Tindall now. Hi, Kenny. Kenny, could you describe yourself?
Yeah, hi, Sarah. Hello, everyone. I'm a white male. I have short, dark hair, a beard, and I'm currently wearing a Zoom favorite, which is a blue jumper, kind of smart, with a more relaxed tracksuit bottom on the underneath because nobody can see it.
Thank you. Kenny is a freelance choreographer, director and resident choreographer at Northern Ballet, and he works nationally and internationally, and has conceived and directed many dance works on film, and has a particular interest in pairing dance with emerging technologies. Now, when I was considering the webinar on virtual production, it was actually Kenny who was one of the inspirations for it, because Icarus, which was funded by XR Stories, isn't a recent project. You developed it a couple of years ago. However, I remember a conversation that we had when you were at the very beginning of that journey. It was a really hot day. We were on FaceTime. Kenny and I have crossed paths in our artistic practice before. And you were so excited about it and exploring it and what it might do, and I remembered the conversation as I was digging into this, and I wanted to ask you sort of to reflect back on that, and then also what your feeling is since is having had that time to reflect on it. So what made you curious as a creative about working with virtual production?
I'm glad you remember that conversation, and it was very exciting, actually. The thing is, what really got me hooked is your imagination is the limit. That's the only limit to this project. That's how virtual production was sold to me, a sort of Imaginarium playground. Wherever I could conceive, it could potentially be done. So that as a starting point to a creative is just, I mean, it's not often you hear that, right? So I guess that was the first thing that got me through the door. But then after that, I'm really interested in how we tell stories, especially in the ballet genre, how we connect with new audiences. And I guess just on a general, how does the physical and the digital work together? I had never really experienced it in the virtual production format. So I just had tons of questions. So that's where the curiosity was how do these mocap suits work? How does this XR stage interact with the form that I know and love? And what will this collaboration look like? So I'd say those were definitely the starting point, and how the new technologies could influence a story was kind of key to the learning of the project, really, Sarah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I love about Icarus is the emphasis that you put on it, on the research element, and it not necessarily having to come out of this kind of fully polished product that's, you know, but something that actually articulates your the things that you were trying to explore. And so on a practical level, because everybody hopefully got the link before and saw a little bit of the kind of the process in action. What was that like for you, sort of practically integrating the dancers with the technology? Can you explore that a little bit?
No, absolutely. Just to pick up on a point you just made, it is a real luxury to be afforded R&D time with no outcome, to go back to process as an artist, to just try to understand and to possibly fail is one of the greatest opportunities that you can be given now, I personally believe. So just being in that environment as a starting point, and then sitting around the table with a huge wealth of collaborators from all different mediums with no fear about what the outcome was, led to such a beautiful investigation of work. That's one of the things I'll take away from the project. So to the question of how did we go about it, the first thing was I had to treat it like a new collaborator. I needed to treat the technology like a dancer, like this was going to be as big as part of the production as the dancers were. So how did we work together? And the truth is, it was lots of trial and error. There was talk about, would it be projection mapping that would be best? Would XR work best? Would mocaps do what we needed it to do? So it was just an investigation around which technologies could work in the form we needed. If we were to keep them in the proscenium arch, what that might look like. Could we work a screen-based set and costumes against a physical set and costumes? Did they work together? Did they work separately? So it was really just trying to be adaptable, because the thing with technology is it isn't predictable. Every time we came to a new technology, there was something we couldn't account for beforehand. So it became a very organic investigation is the best word to say.
So what didn't work? What were the challenges?
Well, so the first stop was a mocap suit, which I think we tried 3 different companies with those suits, and not one of them was able to understand the range of movement of a dancer, which was interesting. I guess because it breaks the normal movement pattern and it goes beyond what the nodes. The other thing that was really difficult, as soon as we started pairing dancers together in what we call pas de deux or pas de quatre, more than one person inside the space at a time confused the information and the feeding back. And then the legs would go on backwards, the arms would go on the wrong place. So it was interesting, and it was a choreography we could definitely not do physically, but it wasn't reading the information quite as we needed it to, or the level that we needed it to. So that was one of the challenges. One of the other challenges is that dance is performed on a sprung floor with lino, because the dancers wear point shoes and special footwear. And without that specific environment, it's hard to do our language, the ballet language. So it was also adapting to that. And then one of the big and exciting parts of the project was getting to work with Production Park, which is an XR stage in Wakefield. And they were also trying out the technology. So all of us were in this sort of learning environment together. But again, the stage was very shallow. The feedback from the cameras was not in high realistic stitching. So there was just basically a lot of brilliant minds trying to figure out all these problems, and most of it we just couldn't even account for. What we sat down at the table and thought, oh yes, could Icarus, be the sun, bleed out of the sun into a real person on the stage, and then go virtually through an avatar back onto the stage? And then what happens if there was water and his wings actually could melt? So it was just a crazy hive of imagination. And for the most part, we didn't reach where we're going to. But what it did do is it started that conversation, especially for my art form, about, can this work in reality in the spaces we need to take it to? Is it affordable? Is it manageable? And most of it, is it time efficient? Can it be done in the short tech times that we have to put it on a stage?
So there's a really interesting mix there of you talking about sort of human power versus sort of computer power, and that kind of reliance on one another. And ultimately, like, computers and technology will break in ways that we won't, and that can be a real challenge. And what you were saying about language, I'm often talking about, in the work that I do around kind of, lots of taking stage to screen into broadcast, is around that kind of translation of languages and where they meet, the language of film, the language of theatre. And just you exploring there the piece around, the sprung dance floor, and in that kind of the challenge that your language then presented to the computer, to the technology language, the LED volume language is really interesting. And of the myriad questions that you had when you were exploring Icarus, when we spoke, I wrote down a couple that really stuck with me. And one was like, can this technology be integrated into physical spaces? Because you were really interested in that. And then how does virtual and reality, in the kind of the real-time piece that virtual production does, that Damian was talking about, how does that create feeling? So I don't know, maybe tackle one and then the other, because that's two quite different questions.
No, they're brilliant questions, and a lot of it for me in storytelling is humanity. There is this brilliant thing about spectacle and being wowed by technology and aesthetics. But at the same time, you can lose all of that and just have the rawness of two people connecting in space with nothing. And sometimes, well, most of the time, that will touch me more as a human than the spectacle will. So it's in going through this, it's trying to find a way that, how do you keep the humanity within these technologies? How do they add to the story? For instance, if you were going to do Peter Pan or A Midsummer's Night's Dream and you needed to move in flight into fantasy, then amazing. But could they affect you just like two people embracing in a space can? Could it create the same humanity? That I'm not sure. It's an ongoing investigation. And my gut feeling is that mixing between the real and the physical are most definitely the key. And remind me of your first question.
And just on that point, I think there's that piece around what is the moment that the kind of choreographic beats and that integration of the real and the virtual really come together and only work. When Icarus gets his wings, for example, that only works in that moment of kind of blurring the two.
Yeah, or there's so much we have restriction on stage for that where this virtual world can just take it to a place you could never even possibly imagine, because there is no barrier. It literally, as Damon mentioned, that Unreal Engine, which is a gaming engine, it is, if a coder can write it, it can be done and it can be imagined. So I think the possibility is endless, and that's what I found from this collaboration. I went in with a lot of questions, but I came out with 100 more, just thinking, oh wow, I need to try this, I need to do that. The potential is staggering, it's wondrous, and it would allow us to tell stories that we possibly wouldn't have even thought possible in ballet before this. And not just ballet, I just speak to my own medium. But yeah, that's definitely some of my findings of it. It just left me more curious and needing to get back in there with the technology. Because the thing is, as an artist, what happens is it can get jargon heavy for me. I don't understand when someone that's from the tech side of it is explaining it. I physically have to get in that space and get hands-on with the equipment and see it firsthand to try to understand it, to digest it, to then be able to use it in a performative way. So that was like this huge cake sitting there, and I got to just touch the icing at the top. And now I need to go back and investigate further.
And my first question that I started with there was about whether the technology can be integrated into physical spaces, because I know you were following an idea around sort of taking the technology.
Yeah. So part of it as well, I was trying to think cleverly about, you know, some companies are performing 108, 225 shows. How could we use this technology to enhance and rest physical dancers, but not lose them from the experience? And part of the question with this one was, could we take this into, you know, site-specific places like stately homes? What if we did a Nutcracker and you had a physical Clara, but the rest of the Nutcracker world was done with the digital? How would that look? How could we move through those spaces? And then again, for education purposes, how could that, the places we can't always reach, how could we use the technology to reach them? And then that gets onto a global level. Like, yes, the company can't tour, it's not sustainable, you don't have the budget for it. But what would happen if you had that recorded entity, or these holograms, or whatever new technology, and we could beam into space? So when we did a 50th anniversary, 100th anniversary, yes, it opens in Leeds Playhouse, or it opens in Covent Garden, but at the same time, it's being projected in buildings, you know, worldwide for free. So it's just like, how can we help it do the legwork and get us out there? And how can we use it to be relevant and tell this and tell stories we wouldn't normally be able to tell, or news stories? There was just, it's, I guess, as you can see, it's a million questions. And I began to answer a small fraction of that.
And I think that's a really, I think that's really powerful in that sense of your experience as an artist, of being able to explore those questions and then, you know, and then, you know, leave through R&D with more, and yes, have those big visions of what it might look like in the future, and actually what are the pieces of the puzzle that might get us there, you know,
exactly,
along the way. Yeah,
no, it's exactly that. And wondrous that there is organizations like XR that you can tap in to do that R&D work, because as it was mentioned, it is expensive technology. And so being able to link with a university, or whoever has that ability, is a great way to start your questions.
Thank you, Kenny.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sarah, which is going to introduce Sarah Ellis, and then we will carry on with the conversations. And to say that I'm flagging the questions that come in, and we will get to them when we have a panel discussion at the end. So over to you two. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've got Sarah squared now. Sarah, can I ask you to describe yourself?
I have short sort of brown hair. I wear glasses. I'm a white person. I have a white t-shirt on, but over the top of that, I have a checkered shirt. I think that's, yeah. And I've got sort of like a smiley face.
Thank you. Sarah is Director of Digital Development at Royal Shakespeare Company, cultivating new artistic initiatives and partnerships. The latest partnership for the RSC is the Audience of the Future live performance demonstrator, funded by Innovate UK. It's a consortium consisting of arts organisations, research partners and technology companies to explore the future of performances and real-time immersive experiences. Sarah, now, when we spoke, you reminded me that your experience with VP at the RSC has evolved over time. And I wondered if you could take us through what are some of the different ways that you've used it as an organisation, thinking about sort of artistic beats and those production workflow beats.
Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. It's one of the best organised panels I've ever been on. I've just got off a flight and I feel totally looked after, so thank you for that. And also just to say, Damian and Kenny, thank you. Like, it's always nice to sit and listen to colleagues and peers in the industry. because whenever you talk about your work, it's obviously in a context, but sometimes when you're delivering your work, you don't have sight on the bigger picture or further afield. And when both Damian and Kenny were talking, I was like, oh, okay, there's similarities there or whatever. But you're right, our journey with virtual production has probably been over the last 10 years. And so that's when I sort of say, you know, it's not new. It's because we've been working with these technologies, but sometimes haven't had a label for it, or it's not been given a wider description, and then suddenly gets one, and then the world gets excited around it, if you know what I mean. But sometimes we need these labels in order to contextualize what this is. And I'm looking in the chat at the same time, and yeah, the AI is definitely part of virtual production and very embedded in it. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But our relationship with virtual production came through an artistic brief, an artistic question, and everything that we've done in my part of the RSC has always been creatively led, and always looked at how we expand the theatre making toolkit, how we look at these technologies in relation to the tools that we already have that were technologies in Shakespeare's day: candlelight, electricity, film, the printing press. They're all technologies that become tools, and we're in this beat now with virtual production where we're seeing these new technologies disrupt, but virtual production has like this catch-all now around what it is. But we started not realizing it was virtual production, but we started using these technologies back in 2013, 2014, when we started to research and develop The Tempest, which was our 2016 production in collaboration with Intel and the Imaginarium Studios. And for the first time on stage, brought a live digital avatar performing in real time by a live actor integrated into the production itself. And so the technologies that Damian was talking about around game engines, Wi-Fi systems to control it, different forms of operation, that was our first bit. And we actually did use some AI in that performance, very, very subtly, but that avatar went through very many manifestations of design. And one of the things we needed to do was make it feel realistic. So an AI algorithm was put in for its face, which wasn't controlled at the time all the time by facial capture of the performer. That it had an algorithm where it randomly moved its facial features to make it feel more realistic. Now, would we do that? It's interesting politically, would we do that now in the same way? It has many more repercussions now. These technologies are much more embedded and much more disruptive in our world. But in that point then, we were probably more experimental or slightly more, how can I say, not realizing the implications of these technologies. So virtual production for us has been about how we bring these new tools and technologies into traditional craft, how they're not a replacement for traditional craft, but they are an extra set of tools for artists, designers, directors, actors, creative teams to be able to do what they want to do. And also that we don't take all those technologies as a given. We take those technologies to see how they can help us enable a story. And ultimately, the thing about theatre is the best storytelling technology there is a live actor. And so these technologies have to work narratively, creatively, imaginatively, and they have to be able to work 8 shows a week, 3-hour shows in live context. So if that technology doesn't work, it's not useful to us. So these are the sort of multiple tests that we've had to apply. But these technologies were incredibly useful to us when our theatres were closed. And so the other beat I wanted to share with you today was when we had to shut our theatres. The Audience of the Future project was about exploring the future of live performance. And we were due to do a performance in a shopping mall in Stratford using a lot of this tech with real people. And actually in that moment, we had to stop production. We recorded the music for it, and we had to stop production immediately and had to pivot. And so we asked our audiences where they were at, and they were craving togetherness, liveness, but there's a huge digital inequity in people's homes. But some of these virtual production technologies allowed us to completely pivot a live in-person performance and make it completely online, deliver an interactive, real-time, motion captured performance with actors in a really safe, COVID-safe volume, but performing to tens of thousands of people across 10 performances. So that's the power of this technology, is not how it often can be shiny or allow you to think of new things, but allows you to think about accessibility, allows you to think about how you can make work for an online audience and a live audience in person, and how in that moment those virtual technologies allowed us to make a 7-kilometre by 7-kilometre virtual forest in a game engine, but it was performed live, but in a 7-metre by 7-metre studio. And it allowed us to create a world where a performance could happen. And audiences believed they were there in that forest with those characters. So it really is thinking about not how these technologies have adapted from film or television and sometimes healthcare in different industries. It's about how we can apply some tools that might be useful for us to tell stories. They might be useful for us to actually connect with audiences we wouldn't ordinarily connect to. And they might help us also with our workflows. So the fact that now we can create a virtual stage, a virtual theatre that's millimetre accurate, the fact that we can put those designs in that means that we can work with collaborators from around the world who we don't have to sort of fly over. It means that we can test a lot of these sets and props before they get loaded into tech. It means that we have some technologies that help our production workflows and that can be used and absorbed in that. But it also means that it's changing the nature of our workforce, and it's changing the nature of who we might connect with as well. And that's super interesting, because if you bring different practitioners or different skills into these worlds, then you're going to get an interesting response in terms of the work that we create. So organisations aren't just physical spaces anymore. They're online, they're in person. We can have a relationship. It's potential to expand our community. It's a potential to make work that we may not be thought of before. For us, it's a potential to imagine those plays by Shakespeare that are 400 years old, that have been constantly reimagined, but maybe for a generation now that is virtual in its day-to-day, that may not come to Stratford, who might still have a connection with us, to look at community, to look at the nature of that work, to not make work in a business as usual type way. That doesn't mean that we don't value our traditional work. It doesn't mean that we don't make it. The opportunity is to expand the possibilities of what we make.
And obviously that journey through that works, through that evolution of the RSC's relationship with VP, obviously that feels like it's taken quite a lot of resource, like internally, externally, to get there. And so how have you, as an organisation, how have you done that, Sarah?
So we are lucky enough to have had additional funding. It's not used any of our core funds. We haven't asked the board for funding, and we haven't had it in our day-to-day budgets. We've been lucky enough to have pitched a lot of this work to companies such as Intel that supported the Tempest financially and technologically and in terms of marketing, and then the Audience of the Future grant, which was a huge asset to multiple organisations. I think we had 19 partners that they all, like many small businesses, universities, research organisations and arts organisations, benefited from financially. So we've been lucky enough to be in the receipt of investment and funding from outside, and we're now looking at how we keep sharing our learnings back. So we've created websites where a bit not dissimilar to how Damian is approaching it, is like how do we grow the ecology. And one of the things I think we can do is share our learnings so that others don't have to like do the mistakes or that we've done that actually do cost a lot of resource. So we've created a website that talks about the tech schematics, the design schematics, how to do it, useful, helpful parts of those processes. And also what we try and do is disseminate all that as much as we possibly can and share where we can too.
Yeah, and you've used the words expansion and expanding quite a lot when we've spoken about virtual production, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
So what we've been trying to do is look at how can I put it? Look at how we develop lots of freelancer skills, lots of like these motion capture technologies, share the equipment, do you know what I mean? Stuff like that that's quite practical. But also the more artists that are playing with it, like in the ways that Damian's supporting in particular, the more we're going to sort of just shake out some of those repeated challenges with it. And I'll go back to, there is nothing better than sitting in the dark with a load of strangers, connecting with a real person and also a real heartbeat, and like multiple real heartbeats. And we know that gets calibrated. But also alongside that we know, like the things like the ABBA Voyage allow you to experiment and play with what live performance means for people. So for us to look at large scale, medium scale and small scale at the same time is hugely important. And I'd say that some of the most experimental work in this space is the most experimental work is done by artists independently. Like that often is where we go to first. And a lot of the pressures in this space have often been on artists, where they've had to create their content and look at distribution models for it as well. So there's a joining up for us to do in our industry and sector, which I think is happening through things like CoStar and through things like investments from different areas. But the real trick to this is the sharing of the learnings to make sure that we're not all set up on these individual tracks and not talking to each other.
Yeah, and that ecology of sort of scale and how one can learn from one another into creating the models that can then exist for funding, producing and sharing this type of work.
Yeah.
And so, because you live and breathe this, and what do you think the future of it is for its adoption in arts practice? Because to go back to what you were talking about at the beginning, is there's the workflow piece and then there's the artistic piece.
Yeah.
And yeah, have you what?
Gosh,
where are you sitting with that at the moment?
Well, when we spoke before, I'm in this sort of like weird phase at the moment where I'm like, oh my God, that was 10 years ago. And I'm like, 10 years. And 10 years ago, I thought a lot of this would move more quickly, and it hasn't. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think in the last few years, we've had a lot going on. But I think it's testament to actually the future of theatre is theatre. Just to say, and that this technology, which is virtual production, I think will bring its own forms out that might not be theatre, but theatre might contribute to those new forms that are emerging. And I think the adoption cycles just take a lot longer than sometimes when we're working in this space. We're quite impatient, do you know what I mean, for everyone to have access and such like. But I think where these technologies take us is really interesting. It's about how we're in the first generation where we have a generation who grew up without the internet and then are now living with it. And we have now a generation who grew up with the internet. And it's an undeniable fact that game engine technology is part of a young person's existence and life. And like as much as watching films or television has been in the 20th century, as much as reading books became a part of your life in the previous centuries. But the fundamental issue is that these tools and technologies only become valuable when they start being equitable. So it wasn't Kelly, I agree with you. We still want heartbeats. It's not I'm not giving a binary yes and no, I'm giving a yes and just to be really clear of that, and I hope I've been clear about that like I mean, we didn't have theatre for a couple of years, did we, over the past few years?
Yeah.
We deeply miss it. And as I say, the future of theatre is theatre, just to be really clear about that.
Because you said something really interesting to me around that ultimately society chooses what's useful with these technologies. And so, and I took the liberty of sort of saying society and therefore audiences, right? And how we consume and how we, and that, you know, you mentioned it before about the equity around technology in people's homes, etc. And one of the problems around VR, that's a whole other, you know, whole other webinar, but around, you know, actually, unless you've got access to these headsets and they're in people's home, how does it work? How do we
we didn't do anything in VR because we didn't, when we were looking at Dream, we wanted to look at scale and entering people's homes, and people just didn't have the headsets. And even then, actually, you know, even access to Wi-Fi, even access to computers is still difficult for many people. Shouldn't be assumed that everyone has access to technologies. Probably phones are the most accessible form of this technology right now. And you're right. I think people shake it out, like generation to generation will shake out what technology is useful to them. And at the moment, we're being offered lots of these technologies. And I think over the next 10, 20 years, we'll settle with, it's a bit like VHS or Betamax. It's like we're going to make choices socially, whether it's down to cost, whether it's down to ease, whether it's down to simplicity. But going back to, this is a generation that are growing up with a different set of challenges and a different set of politics and a different set of connection and a different way of being able to connect. And I think it's complex and complicated. And I think that these technologies at their best should have a convening power, should have a politics around them that isn't about isolation, should be equitable, should be thinking about our data, should be thinking about where that's seen in virtual production. In that sense, when we look at AI, when we look at workforce, we need to be thinking about these things much sooner than we realise. And that's where I go back to the printing press was only valuable, not only valuable, the printing press was most valuable when it stopped just publishing in Latin, but actually then started publishing in English and other languages that real people spoke. So there's something about education, there's something about equity there in this. And I think you're right, big tech is a big concern there. And they're big questions, but I think society does shake out a lot of that over time. But these technologies definitely enabled us at a time of crisis and have definitely enabled us to reimagine Shakespeare's plays for a wider range of audiences.
And I think going back again to sort of talking about this like sense of convening and language and collaboration, and someone asked a question earlier in the chat around, I guess, how different workforce cultures are having to come together to make this type of work, and how organizations therefore manage that. Like, you know, there's expectations around salary and day rates in big tech when you're coming from big tech to versus, I know, rightly or wrongly, I should say, when you're coming from as a theatre maker. And how do you manage that process and that collaboration? And does the RSC have a particular approach to that?
Yeah, no, it's a real live question, equity around that. What we try and do is, we had some sabbaticals of like people from production come in and get those skills there. So like every time we're not bringing in consultants or like people that are paid differently from tech industries, what we're trying to do is build a workforce and build an environment organically. And that's proved really positive, because it means as well that we keep our teams, and it's a form of expansion for them in terms of what they can work with. So that's how we've managed it. But and we make sure that we are as equitable as we possibly can, and also keep those learnings growing for our teams. Really, that's really crucial. People are the most important part of our business.
Yeah, people, coming back again to what Kenny said. When Kenny and I were talking about sort of human power and computer power, and actually, it is us.
People power.
All behind it. Linda, sorry.
Well, I was just I'm noticing the time, and we've got 15 minutes left, so we've got plenty of time. And there was another couple of questions which one of which we could put to Sarah, and then perhaps we'll get the other two back in and just see if there's if we could sort of move into the panel sessions. But that'd be all right. We're happy with that. Well, I mean, I suppose, Sarah, the question was it's for 251, and it says you talk about virtual technologies as a means of preserving performance for future legacy. What are the ethical considerations of maintaining potentially dead virtual performers, or ensuring those performers' avatars are only held and used as intended?
You have that with, yeah, no, I think that's fair. We have that with photos. We have that with a lot of private information about actors, like, we have all their measurements and such, like, costume measurements, and they're kept like form of GDPR and data protection, and film rights as well. Like, you do. It's a really valid question, and I think it, from my perspective, what I've learned is that we have a lot of that already in our care and how we work on that, and I think we apply those values and principles into this next phase about what we can and cannot do, and that we've had that a lot over the years, in terms of, like, we did projects 10-15 years ago, and people's rights of their image and how their image is used, for example, is no different in this space. How things have archived, there are some things that you have to destroy after a certain amount of time. There's some where you might be able to exhibit a virtual performance for a certain number of shows, but after that then there's a rights negotiation. All of those, we have really quite strong principles in theatre around that, actually, and there's a lot you can't do to protect that. So I think that it's of how that migrates over and what the value constructs are there for like capturing a human in those formats.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shall we get the other two back, Sarah?
Yeah.
And then thank you. That's so interesting. There are other questions coming in, but I think Sarah Butcher, you had a question to the whole panel.
Thank you to all of you. It's just really interesting to hear how you bring such context to what is a really broad topic, and it's so valuable to hear about your different experiences and the different things that you're talking about and thinking about as you work through it and work out how it's going to continue to be applied in this area. And I guess what struck me was around each of your organizations is connected through virtual production research. And so I wanted to ask what the value is there between technologists, research practitioners, organizations, and artists for each of you. And it might just be a thought rather than, but I just wondered where you're finding that value.
Shall I just jump in? Sorry, I'm keen not to cut anyone off. I think, Sarah, just collaboration in all its formats is key to keeping organizations relevant, fresh, and moving forward. And this is just like Sarah mentioned, this is another conversation, another collaborator to add to the field. Why in particular it's important with these is because at the moment the technology is very expensive, and being afforded the opportunity to try and work out how it can be used and integrated, this is obviously a really key way to do that. But just collaboration in any sense is, personally as an artist, is what makes me want to create. It's meeting other people, it's seeing another perspective, another lens, and then being able to bring that into my own practice is one of the great joys of making.
Damian.
Yeah, I'll just follow. I always quote Kenny in many of these conversations because of the video he did for us for Exile Stories, and also what he said earlier in his piece, is that, you know, finding an opportunity to collaborate on research that's not predicated on an end product, and that opportunity to test and try and reiterate and to fail is so important. And I think some of the funding and support that's come out more recently is hugely important for enabling that to happen. And I think there's a question just been asked by Kat about sustainability implications of this technology, and that's hugely important actually. There's, you know, particularly a lot of the work that's required to power these new systems and new technologies is, you know, is powerful cloud-based computing, or even, you know, local computing, and that comes with an environmental cost. And it's partnering with big research institutions who are good at doing that kind of long-term sort of investigation into some of, for instance, the sustainability questions around these new technologies and these production workflows are really important for answering some of the big questions that can't be done by any one organization on their own.
I agree. I think at its best, everyone's got to remember their roles and contributions when in collaboration, and why you get these mixed models. And I think having a research partner who doesn't rely on an output or is brilliant, because we need that level of intel and data coming back to us. But from an industry perspective, it's like sometimes we have to put this research out in the live environment as it's a production. And so those sensitivities around delivering something that works become quite a pressure on the creative team, and actually having good relationships with places of research means that we can de-risk that and be as innovative as we possibly can. So it's sort of, I've never not worked in collaboration. I just love it, because it's also, you just learn so much from a wealth and a range of human brains approaching something through their expertise. And then sometimes it has to kick into production, and you have to put something out there that has a contract with an audience, and so it's knowing when those moments are, really.
And I guess where those skills collaborate, because Kenny, you mentioned obviously more, you know, walking into that room and seeing that setup, and then understanding that there are people here whose jobs, you know, I'm elaborating, but there's people here whose jobs I literally do not understand, and I don't understand that what language they're using, to bring it back to that piece that we were talking about earlier about different languages connecting. And I just wonder from an arts organization or an artist perspective, how useful then is that learning to our skills development as an industry?
I think I mean, Sarah said some beautifully articulate things about why technology, how it helped us through when we had to pivot with COVID and all of that. It is absolutely going to be a conversation going forward as AI is introduced, you know, whether we keep it, whether it's let go. So having the space to trial that as an artist is, in some ways, that's going to be the equity of it all. Because if it is part of the conversation and it is going to happen, then we have to create the spaces for especially independents that don't have that source or an organization behind them. How will they keep up and not fall behind? So I'm not saying that, yes, this will definitely be the technology, this is the way we go forward. I agree with everyone that theatre will live, and maybe even for it, flourish against technology in some ways. But we are embracing it, is being used. So finding the opportunities to engage and learn with it is going to be a huge part of going forward. And then for yourself, you take that as an artist, you do that journey and then decide, is it for you, isn't it for you? That's the beauty, isn't it? That we can all be different and we can all go down our own avenues to create an exchange. You don't have to adopt it if you don't like what you're seeing, but I would definitely say, be curious and try and learn what's from you from it. And you might be the person that comes up with this brilliant concept that puts the two together in physical and onto a stage or into a space it would have never even thought of. That's as people engage with that and have their, you know, new challenges, then who will be the next one to break through and find a great way to connect with us? And I think having those experiences and trialing out, like the similar process that I had to XR and other places, it left me, it pushed my imagination, it challenged me. Yes, it didn't reach all the places I wanted it to reach, but it left me with questions and a want to know more, which I think is kind of a beautiful thing as an artist.
And so you feel your skill set as an artist is broadened, and
most definitely. It's like working in film, it's like working in another genre, it's like editing on your software with music. Like, they're all choreography in a way, they're all direction in a way, they're all a show, they're all a part of a bigger package of creating a world. This is a new world, this is a new way to create new worlds. And so stories are about worlds, and here is a technology that you can connect with to try and do that in a different way. And most importantly, I think is what is amazing about the Royal Shakespeare Company, like Sarah said, is how they've engaged with the next generation, a new audience through this medium, still using Shakespeare. That blows my mind. The tradition and the new working together, you know, like upholding it but forging ahead with innovation is, I think, at its best, is what is exciting about what's happening.
Can I interrupt you there? Sorry, and the conversation is going so beautifully, and I'm just mindful of the time. So Sarah Butcher, back over to you. You've got just 3 minutes if you want to kind of just get your panelists to summarise.
Yeah, so I think Linda's already asked you to, if you can just sort of summarize a thought. I thought I would start with one as well, and actually it's a reflection on the BFI application that I put in that was a failure. I think it's really important to talk about your failures as much as your successes. It's part of being an artist and a maker and a creator. And I realized, and I noticed in the chat that, you know, I had this really big idea that I hadn't tested, that I hadn't done the workings out on paper. And actually, from this conversation, I've really taken the value of that moment to kind of go, this is just an element of it that I'm to explore. And what does that then allow you to do? Build those networks, you know, create that foundation for, you know, building on from that work. So that's sort of my final thought and sort of takeaway. Sarah, would you share yours next?
My final takeaway.
Also, final thought, or
Gosh. Oh, final thought. Yeah, gosh. What can I say? I think we're at this inflection point where we've had a lot of shiny examples of what this technology is, and I think now it's about, like, genuine, is it useful, is it purposeful, how can we apply it? And I think that both Kenny and Damian are much closer to that than maybe I am at this present moment. But what I would say is that everything is about, we must work together. Finding the opposition is, do you know what I mean, is sometimes good, because then you can draw things out. But the sharing of expertise, of learnings, when we didn't get it right and when we did get it right, is really crucial. There's no sell on this. This isn't, do you know what I mean? This is about critiquing and going, is this useful to our practice in this moment, I think.
Thank you. Kenny, come to you next.
I mean, just exactly what Sarah said, in complete agreement. But also thank you to you all, because it's a continual learning curve, and amazing to hear from Damian and Sarah. I have a lot of questions I have to go away and process, and I'm jotting down as we speak. But also to the space, and to Sarah as well. It's just important that there's platforms like this to talk about the work and to give that opportunity, because I think lots of people have so many questions, and quite often we just don't know where to turn to start answering them, and that can get us stuck in our field. So just thanks for having me on and for continuing the learning process.
Thank you. And Damian.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and to Kenny and Sarah, Ellis. You know, it's been a fantastic conversation and discussion, and I've loved it. And I think my final point is, you know, hopefully I made this at the start, is that virtual production is not a single monolithic entity, as we've kind of explored. Really, it's a collection of things, and probably more important than that, it's a collection of people experimenting and exploring what those things mean for them in their practice. So I would encourage our audience to go and pick and choose what might work for them, and pick and choose and find the people who can help you realize those ideas, and don't get too hung up on the big ticket items along the way.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. And I'll hand back over to Linda.
That's it. I think you've said everything there is to say. That seemed like a beautiful place to end.